Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Milanus, and with Marilyn Kuliker, Martha Elders, we would like to welcome you to the Global Cultural Symposium. I want to thank all the participants who came from 4 different continents to share with us their personal experience of bringing the revelation into their own culture. This project started 3 years ago. Our committee pondered about how to bring the Urantia Book to other civilizations, taking in consideration their cultural heritage. The same and single approach of disseminating the teaching doesn't always work and could even work to the contrary. Let me read you 2 quotes of the Urantia Book which inspired us. The first one is, "But it is foolish to attempt the too sudden acceleration of religious growth. A race of nations can only assimilate from any advanced religion that which is reasonably consistent and compatible with its current evolutionary status, plus its genius for adaptation. Social, climatic, and economic conditions are all influential in determining the course and progress of religious evolution." And the second one is, "Each race must become familiar with the thought of all races. Each nation must know the feelings of all nations." So as the book finds its way into the world through different continents, many countries and culture, it becomes more and more necessary to be acquainted with and to understand this culture in order to reach and serve in a better way the propagation of the revelation. It will permit to reach people of different culture in accordance with their cultural development, and by understanding the evolutionary development of different civilizations, we realize new opportunities of introducing the teachings into other cultures in unique ways. And it will give us a global view of the evolutionary context of different parts of the world and show their current status. We have been focusing on countries we didn't know much about from different continents where the book is started to be known through few dedicated individual pioneer readers. Countries from all around the world with their cultural differences and the challenges that these readers encountered. It will help to understand better these unknown parts of the world. Today we are happy to welcome readers from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, South America, North America, and Europe. So let's start this unique and great symposium. Before we start, I would like to introduce the first participant. Her name is Ade Awoyinka of Nigeria, and she comes to us from London. She lives in Nigeria for 13 years, mostly as a teenager and a young adult, and she's been reading the book since the 1st of July 1996. She currently serves as Vice President of the Urantia Association of the United Kingdom and Ireland. I've met Ade in 2002 in Dourdan at the international conference, Urantia conference in France. And from time to time, together, we organize in France, in Brittany, long weekends of topical study between the British readers and the readers of Brittany. So we have something we do in common. So now I leave Ade speaks.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's just worth me slightly managing expectations. I've lived, as Claire said, in Nigeria for 13 years of my life. I was quite heavily involved in fundamentalist Christianity as well as conventional Christianity in Nigeria. My tradition is of the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, if you like, and it has kind of given me some insight into Nigerian thinking around religion. But because I've been out of the country quite a long time, I did actually run my slides past And I had a very long discussion with a Nigerian reader called Emeka. He's just starting study groups in Nigeria, so I checked out my impressions against somebody on the ground, and fortunately we agreed on the stuff that I was saying. The other thing I think it's worth mentioning is that I'm just one person. There are 100 million Nigerians, and I cannot begin to speak on behalf of 100 million people. So what you're getting from me is slightly my experiences. Some of this I know of that I speak, some of it I've checked my own experiences against research online. So I'll just quickly run through the contents of my slides. So I'm going to talk about the distribution of religion in Africa. I'm going to talk about religion in Nigeria. I'm also going to talk about the prevailing belief system in Nigeria. I want to give some insight to you about the kind of broad structure of Nigeria. That's the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Talk about linguistic groups. I'm going to say a little bit about personal religion, the importance of family life, the value of women, the status of education, art, leisure, politics, and disseminating the Urantia Book in Nigeria. Then I finish on just some observations about practical ways of spreading the word. So I'll just move on now to the slide on Africa and just talk a little bit about the broad religious groups in Nigeria. So I thought it was worth starting with Africa because the green bit denotes Islam, and the majority of North Africa is actually Islamic, and we're talking about the Maghreb. And if you can think, I'm not quite sure how it shows on the screen, but if you think in the right northeast corner, if you think of that being the Middle East, what was happening way back was traders would come from Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, and they would penetrate North Africa, and they would trade. And there was something called the Trans-Saharan trade route, and with their trade they brought their religion. So their religion penetrated through the northern parts of a lot of West African countries, including Nigeria. Now I thought the reason it didn't penetrate, Islam didn't penetrate that far south, was simply the terrain, because the northern part of Africa is generally quite desert, quite arid. When you get further inland, you are getting into the kind of forests and the mangrove swamps. But what I did discover was actually they were seen off by the, I guess, the people in the south. I'm not going to go as far as saying the Christian south, because they weren't necessarily Christian at that point. And if you can imagine the missionaries coming in, through with their ships into the ports along the West African coast, probably, further down, you can see the influence of Christianity. So what you had was the north being predominantly Muslim and the south being predominantly Christian. That's not to say there aren't any Muslims in the south, and that's not to say that there aren't any Christians in the north, but that's the broad outline of the religion. And in the next slide, I go on to talk about that in more detail, the actual split. So as you can see, the broad split in Nigeria is 50-48, 50% Muslim, 48 Christian, and the slither of yellow, other religions. At one time it was supposed to be about 50-50. I'm just wondering if, because there's possibly a higher birth rate amongst the Muslims, the balance is being slightly tilted. Okay. So the next slide, I'm going on to talk about the prevailing belief system in Nigeria, and I just thought it was worth a quote. I got this was from a Nigerian. I got this off the website. And religion in Nigeria plays a major role in the life of the people. To some, it is their candlelight. It gives them insight, wisdom, knowledge, and faith is increased through the study of scripture, books, and prayers. In Nigeria, religion helps us remain in line and stay focused. And if I could summarize the Nigerian attitude towards religion, I would say two things. And I checked this against the Nigerian, and it's interesting, even before I said it, he'd made the same comment. Nigerians are God-fearing, and they fear God. And there are two things I'd say about that. One, they have a lot of reverence for God. You very rarely find Nigerians reporting as atheists. I think I only ever came across one. Nigerians fear God. They fear very much the wrath of God. And that's why I'm particularly keen, you know, for Nigerians to have the experience of the Urantia Book, to remove that fear of God and to replace it with the religion of love. But that's the general psyche. Nigerian religion is also permeated by Nigerian traditional beliefs. And because you're in a country where you can take for granted in the West that things are explainable, even if they seem slightly arbitrary, you're dealing in a society that is still developing, and there's an awful lot of turbulence, and you're also dealing, and I'll get on the backdrop of a world that doesn't necessarily have access to the knowledge and the education that other societies have. So when things are not explained, they are explained away as being brought about by spirits, ghosts. There's a lot of conflation between spirits and demons. Practically anything that's not explained, anything that's unexpected, has its origins in some sort of spiritual force. It's unfortunate that there is a tendency in Nigeria, and I'm sure not just in Nigeria, to not necessarily see the universe as a friendly place. It's full of entities that need to be placated, traditional deities that wrought all sorts of misfortune, sickness on people. So often, even in the conventional churches, that's the backdrop. Then if you go into the more Africanized churches, there is a lot of emphasis on placating spirits, of trying to speak to spirits, a lot of ritual, a lot of superstition. I just thought it's just worth to pause a little so you can understand a little bit about the way Nigeria is structured. It's actually structured broadly like the United States. Lots of individual states, actually. When I first went to Nigeria, there were 12 states. There are now 36. I certainly can't remember them off the top of my head. I used to know the 12 pretty well, but it fragments all the time. And each of these states are, think America, are broadly autonomous. They're run by governors. In terms of linguistic groups, there are a lot of languages spoken in Nigeria, all mutually incomprehensible. There are three main language groups, I would say. Hausa, which is spoken in the north, and it's pretty homogeneous. A lot of people in the north actually speak Hausa. Then you have Yoruba, which is another quite big language group that's spoken in Lagos and in the west. Then you have Igbo, that is spoken to the east of Nigeria. Then there are lots of other minor language groups in between, and it does create quite a lot of suspicion, because having one language is quite helpful, because you feel a kind of affinity with somebody who speaks the same language as you. But the good news is that the lingua franca of Nigeria is English, so it's not. People generally speak some kind of English, so they can speak to each other. I found actually talking about personal religion quite hard, to be honest with you, because it's so personal. But I always think of personal religion really as how you express the God as the Father and man as your brother. And I think that is something that I don't think is unique to Nigeria. I think it's something to a certain extent that outside of the Urantia community is slightly lacking. I think the focus has always been on religions and conventions and traditions as opposed to creating your own personal belief system. And I think there is a propensity in Nigeria for Nigerians to kind of tap into the prevailing church culture in Nigeria. I think it's just worth saying in Nigeria what I found quite interesting. When I was there, we kind of Pentecostal fundamentalists had, you know, tiny little churches, almost shacks, if you like. But Nigerians have always been very taken with the American style of tele-evangelism. So what you started to find in the 90s in Nigeria were enormous churches growing up. And I think this happened because in the 90s in Nigeria, the mid-80s throughout the 90s, Nigeria went through an enormous economic shock. And people had their savings decimated overnight. And there was an enormous move towards these very large churches. And it was explained to me, and I, you know, trying to understand why, you know, these churches grew up. And I think, again, you know, not dissimilar to some of the old school evangelists. And I'm pretty old. I'm thinking of people like T.L. Osborne, people like Jimmy Swaggart, some of the big American evangelists. The message was put to Nigerian people: if you pay your tithes, you know, we can guarantee you prosperity. And so Nigerians would go there because they had severe problems, and it was very difficult for people to understand. I mean, this is something that I personally experienced because I had family in Nigeria. So there was this enormous search for answers to this tremendous economic dislocation the country was going through, and people turned to these very large churches. And they still very much exist in Nigeria. So family life is at the centre of Nigeria. Nigerian families are extended. I think the concept of having a cousin is quite a Western concept. Everybody is a brother or sister within the family, and it's not uncommon to, you know, have your cousins several generations under one roof. Children are very, very central to family life. I have yet to come across a Nigerian couple who have chosen not to have children. Children are seen very much as a blessing from God. Fortunately, I think families are becoming smaller. I think because women are staying in education longer, but of my parents' generation, it was not at all uncommon to find, you know, women having up to 8 children. Polygamy was quite widespread. It's not so much now because I suspect economically it's quite expensive to run several wives, particularly of the generation, my generation and generations after me. I think it's less prevalent. You do find it still happening amongst some of the traditional chiefs in Nigeria. The mores are pretty flexible. Families are, like in the West, are becoming blended. And I would say, in line with the Urantia Book teachings, I think marriage has become slightly more unstable in Nigeria. You're finding, you know, many more broken families, and you're also finding women heading up households, single parents, and even, strangely enough, actually single women, which wasn't very common when I was there, when I was both a child and a young adult. I would say that women's social role in Nigeria tends to be very traditional. They are prized as mothers, wives, daughters, sisters. Their visibility in public life tends to depend on their religious background, as you would expect in the more Islamic culture. They tend to be more private. That's not to say in all cases. When I lived there, it was not uncommon for girls from an Islamic background to leave school if they went to school at around 16. I suspect this is changing quite a lot because people are seeing the value of educating women. However, there is a noticeable difference. In the South, which is predominantly Christian, women do tend to play a much more prominent role. And I would say religion, just in line with the teachings of the Urantia Book, has actually been used to subjugate women. And also it kind of chimes with the culture where women play a subordinate role, and it's expected that the husband is the breadwinner and is the head of the household. Also, I don't think till today there has been a female governor of any of the states, although there are women that are taking quite a prominent role in political life. You're getting women in the Senate and in the House of Representatives in Nigeria. Education in Nigeria is seen as extremely important. I've got some statistics. The literacy rate is about 60%, 59.6%. And that's people above the age of 15 that can read and write. It's progressing, but unfortunately Nigeria has suffered from the hands of militant Islam through something called Boko Haram, which means actually Western education is forbidden. There is this kind of suspicion of them from the Muslim North, and particularly militant Islam, that the South, which is slightly more educated, wants to dominate. And also there is a whole group of disaffected youths that can't find work. Bear in mind, this is a country that is unevenly developed. The oil wealth is towards the South. The North has traditionally been a lot poorer than the South. So this has been quite a hotbed for radical Islam. And although Nigerians prize education, in this radical Islam is just seen as such an anathema to the way Nigerians want to progress through education, but a serious thorn in the political side of Nigerians. I just wanted to make a few comments about religion, science and philosophy, and say that religion and science are taught below, well, they're taught at all levels, right up through university. Philosophy generally is taught at university levels. There was quite an exchange, I don't know if it's still the case, between teachers, particularly from America, would come to Nigerian universities and teach philosophy, so it was quite an important subject in Nigeria. Although science isn't particularly developed. I mean, you do not have the research facilities that you might expect outside of Nigeria, particularly in the richer countries in the West, but science is, important. The professions that are greatly prized in Nigeria are things like medicine, law, accountancy, business, etc. The arts not so much so, but who knows, it might be changing. Art has always played a very important part in Nigerian culture. Going back to the 15th century, what I've got here are the Benin bronzes, which were actually stolen from Nigeria by the British, and they're somewhere in some museum. Nigerian contemporary art does flourish, but it's not the profession of choice for most parents because it's not very much funded by the government, but there are quite a number of renowned Nigerian artists. They thrive in spite of not very much help from the government. in terms of leisure, again, it's quite hard. I found this one also quite hard. I drew from my own experiences in Nigeria, and I also checked those experiences out against what's happening now. Again, you have to remember you're talking about a country where some people live on probably a couple of dollars a day, so their access to leisure activities is obviously going to be constrained by their relative poor economic situation. However, where people do have the money and they do have the time, Lagos has diverse cuisine. Some of the best Chinese food I've ever eaten was in Lagos. There is a proliferation of Nigerian authors. Novels and literature are very important. One of Wole Soyinka is a very prominent Nigerian author. He received the Nobel Prize for Literature. Music, dance and theatre are very, very much embedded in Nigerian culture, and Nigerians do not need any excuse for dancing. In the 1970s, Nigeria had a kind of, I don't know how international it was, but they had something called Festac, which was a festival of the arts in Nigeria. It was an opportunity to showcase Nigerian traditional culture, and they built a enormous theatre actually to symbolize Nigerian culture and Nigeria's investment in the arts. There's something called Nollywood, which is supposed to be, I think, a Nigerian take on Hollywood, and it's actually quite important. There are lots of actresses that quite fancy themselves as international actors as well as international players, and they put on quite a lot of they do lots of videos, and they showcase a lot of Nigerian culture, a lot of Nigerian values about family life, family ups and downs, sort of mini soap operas, and it's quite a burgeoning industry. There's a huge interest in football. Many Nigerian footballers are found in international teams. A lot of them play for teams across Europe, and Nigeria participates in football quite globally. So I'm going to talk about politics in Nigeria. Nigeria is a nascent democracy. Nigeria's had quite a number of political upheavals. It's had quite a number of coups where the military have taken charge of Nigeria. Basically, democracy has failed. Sometimes I think because the politicians haven't really addressed the needs of the people. There's been a lot of corruption. Nigeria is starting the Third Republic. It only started around 1999. We hope it continues. Democracy is quite fragile in Nigeria. Usually when the army takes over, it doesn't generally interfere with people's religious freedoms, but it does interfere with freedom of speech. So if you had a coup, it's very disruptive. It just could make life slightly more difficult. There's a lot of suspicion. So if you were on the ground trying to disseminate the Urantia Book, I'm not saying it would stop necessarily, but I'm suggesting you'd have to be maybe a little bit more careful than you would normally under a democratic government. So I was just thinking about some of the advantages, some of the challenges of disseminating the Urantia Book in Nigeria. Whereas in the West you might be wrestling with secularism, you are pushing against an open door in Nigeria. Although, having said that, I think one of the challenges is to try and realign Nigerian thinking and Nigerian religious thinking to make it more focused on the revelatory religion of love rather than the old religions of authority and fear. And you know, those religions are pretty entrenched in Nigeria. I always think some of the, probably the greatest challenges that we would face in Nigeria are the taking away the livelihood of some of these enormous churches that telling Nigerians that miracles are far and few between will be quite a challenge, because people are always looking towards quick fixes. Who doesn't? But, you know, those are some of the challenges. I think, you know, as I said, you know, Nigerians are quite religious. They're generally welcoming of non-Nigerians. They're generally quite hospitable. Lagos, there is a study group in Lagos. Lagos seems to be the melting pot of the whole of Nigeria, really. Most ethnic groups are represented in Lagos. It's not the capital of Nigeria anymore. The capital was moved further inland, but it's a commercial hub. It's where it's all happening. It's, if you like, it's the New York of Nigeria. I think some of the challenges of disseminating the Urantia book in Nigeria are, one of the biggest problems in Nigeria is the poor supply of electricity. I don't know when they're going to resolve that. You just have to try and think about what it means to have an unreliable supply of electricity. It makes it difficult for you to engage the internet as much as you might do in a culture where you take these facilities for granted. There are still quite low literacy rates in Nigeria. Sorry. And there's poor financial transparency. Nigeria is quite a corrupt country, unfortunately. There's poor infrastructure, not great transport. I mean, you can get around, but it's slightly more challenging than you might find in other countries. I mean, there is infrastructure, but it's you know, Nigeria is a developing country and that needs to be accepted. There's quite a lot of inter-ethnic rivalry, but more importantly, there is a lot of sectarianism. There's a tremendous face-off now between the northern radical Islam and the south. It never used to be like that. They seem to accommodate each other, but it flares up from time to time. So that's the kind of context in which you would be working. The Urantia book would be accepted differently depending on who you were speaking to, because there are moderate Muslims apparently that can perfectly listen and hear the truths of the Urantia book, but then you've got the more radical Islam that is so focused on a very fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. So it depends on really where you are. If you're in the north, you would probably need to think of a very different way of engaging people, as opposed to in the south, where you have a mixture of Christians, all the churches in the south, both African, all the churches you'd expect to see, Baptist, Anglican, Methodist, and I think a much more moderate Islam. So I just wanted to think about how, you know, to actually spread the book in Nigeria, some sort of practical things to think about. And I was thinking, I personally think the best people to spread the book in Nigeria are the people on the ground. I was thinking that, you know, in future, if there are conferences in Nigeria, it would be great to ask Nigerians, the very same things you've asked me, get them into syndicate groups to talk about how they got the book, how do they think it should be, you know, transmitted through Nigeria. And I'm sure they'll, you know, be able to give you a much more detailed account than I can, because they will be much more alive to some of the challenges. I can speak at only a high level. They will be much more intimate with some of the challenges and the pitfalls to avoid. I think facilitate study groups. get Nigerians to get together and study. When I was speaking to a Nigerian reader, he says one of the big problems with Nigerians, well, Nigerians speaking about Nigerians, is there tends to be a kind of intellectual incuriosity. Nigerians are more than happy for someone to stand up here and preach to them. Just tell me what to do. Preach to me. Don't expect me to pick up the book and leaf my way through it, trying to deal with hard concepts. And so I think need to change that culture, need to change that mindset by getting people together in study groups, getting people to think through the concepts that are being transmitted by the Urantia Book, getting people to own them, to understand them, to interpret them, and not to look to the pastor, who is a great figure of authority, the religious leader, who is a great figure of authority, to actually develop your own personal religious experience. Another thing I was thinking also is to allow leaders to emerge. I think there's always a danger of saying, oh great, it'd be great if you guys could join the RUA or this or that. And I think what's happened, and this has been a bit of an issue in the UK, yeah, people will join, but you don't always get the quality of leadership that you need. You get people who don't really have a vision. What you want really, I think, is somebody who has a vision of how they can contribute to the RUA, how they can align their local association with the RUA. So I think don't be too hasty in trying to sign people up. Facilitate it, put the idea in people's heads, yes, but allow leaders to emerge. And you know, it may take time. I think also highlight Nigerians' natural gregariousness, Nigerians' natural tendency to be sociable. And also, I think I'm just going to end my presentation on one point. We need to build our own spiritual resilience. And what I mean by that is that the evolution of this planet is slow. It's not always linear. There will be mistakes made. There will be times that you become discouraged. There are times you wonder whether it's worth it. And we need to be ready to deal with this internally by ensuring that we are spiritually resilient. We have cosmic stamina in order to deal with some of the failures. It may not always work. You might try something, it doesn't work. And also we need to develop patience. Sometimes you may sow seeds that may not bear fruit in your lifetime, but I think I really believe that the revelators and the celestial supervisors really want to disseminate the Urantia Book, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. And I think it will do much. It may not solve Africa's problems, but it will do much to help people, to give people a tool, you know, to meet their everyday challenges of a sometimes really difficult and unpredictable life. And that's where I'd like to end. Thank you. Yes.
What's the population of Nigeria?
I think it's about 100 million now. The Nigerians never agree on censuses, but it's estimated to be about that.
I have a question. You talked earlier on about the fragmentation of the states. You've gone from a smaller number to like 36 now.
Yeah.
Something like that. How do you see that progression? Do you anticipate more fragmentation? Or are they starting to come together in some ways? What's the direction?
It's hard to say, but the problem is when you've got fragmented ethnic groups, they feel unless they have a state, they're not fully represented. So people are always clamoring for more states. And, you know, somebody pointed out, Nigeria is about the size of Texas. And, you know, you've got America is way bigger than Nigeria, just 50 states. You know, why will the country the size of Nigeria need 36 states? Now, some of these states, I think, are political, because every time you've got a state, you create a state governor, you create an enormous bureaucracy. I don't know personally whether it actually brings the government closer to the people. Maybe it does. I'm not sure. You'd like to, it's hard to say. I mean, we had 12, we went to, I think, 20 something, then it suddenly morphed into 36. I mean, I'm constantly having to work out which states that I come from. Basically, I've come from about 3 different states in my lifetime. So I don't know is a short answer. I'd like to think it has settled now. I think it's going to be a bit ridiculous if it fragments further.
When you talked about languages in Nigeria,
Yeah.
you said that English is the common language.
Yeah.
So is it the official language as well? What is the official language?
It's the official language. Yeah, I think it's the official language.
News broadcasters are in English, is that it?
The news broadcasts are in English, and about the federal news, the news that covers the whole of Nigeria, if you like, at least when I was there, was in English. And I think they did maybe some highlights in some of the other languages, but each of the states will have probably its own broadcasting company, so it may well do news in English, but it will also do news in some of the indigenous languages.
So, for example, in schools,
Yeah.
you teach the students 2 languages, is that it, depending on the state?
I think it depends on the school. The better schools, I have to say, teach in English.
So not all schools teach English language?
There are apparently some schools that teach in languages other than English, but the better schools teach in English, because you will be very handicapped if were you to leave school in Nigeria not being able to at least make yourself understood in English. You are going to find it fairly challenging in certain professions if you do not speak English, and certainly the universities teach, unless they're obviously teaching a language such as French or Portuguese or German, they definitely use English as their medium. So yeah, generally, predominantly English, I think, in answer to your question.
Would you say that it's important that the Urantia book is translated into other languages, local languages, in order to further its spreading in the future? Or English is enough?
I think that's quite hard, because generally people who are educated speak and write English. So I would say focus on English before putting it into other languages, because people are generally going to speak English. I mean, I think that's a second order thing. Maybe when it's more spread across Nigeria, Nigerians may choose to translate it into Yoruba. And I think that will be more a matter of, I don't know that it would be a matter of practicality. It might be a matter of ethnic pride. You want to see it in your own language. So.
One more comment. I'm not the best person to describe this, but there has been an approach done in other countries in Africa with Muslim people, and being in
Yeah.
other entrepreneurs who have devised a way to say, bypass some of the antagonism that Islam may have towards the teachings.
Yeah.
So you're familiar with that?
I met Musa. I am familiar with Musa. I'm not saying that it can't be disseminated in the north of Nigeria, but I think the approach in the north is going to have to be slightly different from the south. You can engage in that. You can generally engage Nigerians in a discussion about religion randomly. You can meet a random Nigerian and discuss religion with them. I have done that myself because we were very much encouraged when I was at college to witness to people So you would just talk to somebody about Jesus, so you could do that. Now, I suspect if you get into the Boko Haram areas, you would have to find a different approach as to how you engage people in discussion about religion.
So do you think that it would be a good thing that students in universities would be the one to be taught about the Urantia Book, because these are the new generations that will be raising kids with the right frame of mind, right?
Totally agree. I mean, I was speaking to Emeka, he's a reader in Nigeria, and we were talking about this because I thought, well, surely you'd start at the universities. Although I don't know whether it's just simply the way things are at the moment, but he's saying it's been quite difficult to penetrate the universities. They did try to set up a study group in Lagos University, I think. He said it wasn't particularly successful, but I think it's more to do with the boots on the ground, because, you know, what I understand, I'm sure there are other readers, there seem to be two main readers in Nigeria. So I still think the universities would be the starting point, because some of the concepts in the Urantia book are fairly challenging, and I would expect university students to take up that challenge probably first before you might get non-university students.
Go ahead.
Okay, do you have a Nigerian community in London or do you have any readers in England?
I'm not aware of any Nigerian readers in England.
No?
No, I'm not. The Nigerian community, there is a very strong Nigerian community in London, but Nigerian community generally coalesces around churches. That's where you find the majority of Nigerians. So no, I've not really come across anybody at all, to be honest.
I was going to ask if you think that, in your opinion, if the Nigerians in general are spiritually hungry, are they dissatisfied with what they currently have? What's your take on that?
Well, I think I don't know. I think Nigerians tend to be a bit fatalistic. You know, it's just the way it is, because I think they need to be challenged. Though I suspect there are some truth seekers. I'm a Nigerian. I was a truth seeker. I got to a point where I felt there was something beyond what I'd understood. Yeah, I guess there are truth seekers out there, because many of I was talking to a reader about many of the ministries from America were taken up by Nigerians. Some very esoteric ministries from America were taken up by small groups of Nigerians. So I think there are pockets of Nigerians that are truth seekers. But like a lot of people, they like to be fed their religion. And but I believe it is possible that there are people out there that are spiritually hungry and want something different. Emeka, the reader that I'm in contact with, is one of those people. He's really taken and run with the Urantia book.
So would you say that evangelism, so to speak, is acceptable?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. I would imagine you could probably, I don't know whether you pull in the crowds that some of the big evangelists in Nigeria do, because you wouldn't necessarily be promising people miracles, but evangelism is very, very prevalent in Nigeria, very.
So really this would be a wonderful way to teach the Urantia book.
Yeah. If you could get people into, Emeka was saying he was pretty certain he could get thousands of people. I said, okay, fine, if you can. But it's a question of how you present it. And I think people would listen.
It's like what Jesus did. What Jesus did. Sorry, he started with the poor and the non-educated, so to speak, and grew in numbers that way.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a possibility in Nigeria.
It is. It's how you pitch the message, basically. If you pitched it maybe as a God of love might be of interest to people.
So starting with the simple truth, rather
Yeah.
than the fifth epochal revelation as...
Yeah, I agree. The fifth epochal revelation will get pockets of people interested, in as much as the end time ministries that were disseminated from America had pockets of people interested. Fifth epochal revelation will be quite esoteric, but if you try to say, look, you know, I wanted to, you know, there's a new gospel, let's talk about the love of God and, you know, his ministry to you, and his oversight would be I think, a great way of maybe pitching it.
Ade, have you attended any of the study groups there? Have you been over there?
In Nigeria? No, I haven't. I haven't even attended any of the conferences, but I'm hoping one day to go to one of the conferences there. So no, I'm afraid I haven't attended any of the study groups.
I'm curious if they're different in any way, or how if they do any outreach in any way, what it's like, how they grow, how they blend.
I think my understanding, I'm not quite sure how they're growing, but I think that they do a lot of stuff over the internet, because simply the distances between people. The person probably that would be probably able to answer that question a lot better would be Peter Banton, because I think he goes there quite a lot.
Do you think the introduction of the Urantia book would be perceived as a religion in Nigeria?
I think there is I think there possibly is a danger that it might be, but I don't think anybody who seriously read the book could actually say it was a religion. They might necessarily think at the first instance that you were the Urantia religion or something, but I think if they actually studied the book, I'm not sure you could hold it together as a religion. I'm not getting the sense from speaking to the Nigerian I was speaking to that people are seeing it as a religion, but I do take your point that that is a possible risk.
You didn't say much about unrecognized religions in Nigeria. Is it because there aren't any, or?
Practically every religious faith is in Nigeria. When you talk about unrecognized religions, what are you thinking? What were you thinking about?
For example, in Lebanon, you need recognition by the state to be a recognized religion.
There's religious freedom in Nigeria.
Okay, so you can just walk in and say, I go to a church.
Oh yes. Oh, they do that. Oh yes. Oh yes. Some people went to India and came back with some very strange faith in the 1990s.
So it's fairly easy to integrate the Urantia book.
Oh yeah.
From practical point of view. Yeah.
The Constitution should actually guarantee you religious freedom. Everybody's building these churches, you know, these sects, all sorts of. The Rosicrucians, for example, are represented in Nigeria. The Baha'i faith is represented in Nigeria. Not many, but at least when I was there were Baha'is.
Sorry, it seems that I'm the only one asking questions. Would you say that religious prosecution exists there?
In the north, it never used to.
Is it just constrained to Boko Haram, or?
I think it's Boko Haram inspired, radical Islam inspired. So Christians were killed in the north, not in the south, as far as I'm aware.
In the south.
Yeah, because.
Is it easy for one to shift from one religion to another?
Yes, I think so. I've met people who shifted from Christianity to Islam. Sorry?
Without prejudice from society or family?
Well, it is actually, because generally when women marry, they take on their husband's religion. So I've seen Christian women who've converted to Islam on marriage, and it doesn't seem to create any prejudice. I flitted around several churches. I mean, okay, that wasn't changing my religion, but I suspect in certain families it's entrenched, because I was quite fortunate in my family. One of the things my father never did was ram religion down our throats. So within my family, you had Muslims, you had Catholics, you had Baptists, you had a whole range of different religious faiths. But in some families, I guess it's quite entrenched. It might be frowned on if you suddenly went from being a Catholic to being a Protestant or something, or you became a born-again Christian. But the persecution wouldn't be to the extent that you would necessarily fear for your life. Again, I cannot speak for the more radical Islamic North, I can't say. Because even if I lived there, I would live in the South. The North is a bit uncharted territory.
It's interesting, a couple of points you made, that especially with religious freedom, that one might think there's a great opportunity there, because you talked about political upheavals, you talked about economic dislocation, and that situation, it would be easy to assume that people are not getting the answers that they wanted. So what's out there? How can I better understand what's happening in my world?
Yeah, I think for those people willing to invest some intellectual thought into it, yes, I totally agree.
I have a question, Ade. Do you know anything about the book habits and reading habits of Nigerians? Do they like books? Do they buy books?
Yes.
Is there a big library system?
No, not when I was there. They like books. People, the shops full of books. Nigerians are from educated homes. Those that can read, even though education is prized, so people read a lot in Nigeria. It might be slightly changing, bearing in mind when I was there was no internet, and your basic entertainment was actually reading novels, and we circulated books a lot around our friends. But there are libraries in Nigeria, but they tend to be more in the universities. There weren't that many public libraries you could go into, but people definitely read books, definitely. And there are lots and lots of very prominent Nigerian authors.
I'm wondering too, now with smartphones, and people might be reading on books, and that would be, on phones, and then it would be a great way to reach people, so that since the physical book is probably hard to get there, but free download is.
Totally.
So we could
Totally.
word out that way.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. That was my understanding from the guy that I spoke to. He said he got the Urantia book off the internet, so yeah.
Just a question about resources. Are there, in your opinion, are there resources that would be helpful, things that, Urantia Foundation or others can provide to help spread the book in Nigeria?
Yeah, one of the things that apparently has been really helpful is people getting a bundle so they can have internet access. I don't quite know how these bundles work, but the IUA has funded bundles so that you can have study groups online. It's the kind of, I guess it's a kind of prepaid way of engaging the internet. So that's anything that facilitates online engagement, basically.
So would you say that people from your homeland are willing to borrow some of the more core concepts of Christianity, more apt to borrow than what maybe we would find with those kinds of situations in this country or in England? They're not so attached to those core beliefs that they couldn't be open to the expansion that you get from the Urantia book and looking at that, you think?
No, I think they would borrow. I think they would be very keen to borrow concepts. I mean, Nigerians borrowed a number of concepts from Christianity,
right.
And I can see them borrowing concepts from the Urantia book.
And embracing those new ways of thinking.
I think so. Yes, I think so.
So from everything that was said, it seems like Lagos, Abuja, the places where there's internet, electricity, universities, students, online access, young people, those are the places that are going to be better suited for starting.
I think Lagos will be key. Abuja, possibly because it's the federal capital. There are universities scattered all over. There are loads of universities in Nigeria. There's a proliferation of universities in Nigeria. I don't know how many there are now. When I was there was about 6, but there's a real proliferation of universities scattered all over. Even in the north there are universities. So I would like to think of it travelling through the universities, because the universities had a very strong Christian tradition when I was there. You had, that's where you had your fellowships and your Bible studies and your various religious groups in Nigeria, in the university. So I wouldn't see the Urantia Book as being outside of that at all.
Do you still have brothers and sisters? Many relatives?
I have quite a lot of cousins in Nigeria. I have a half-sister in Nigeria, but my family's scattered all over the world. I've got quite a lot of family in America, actually.
So you keep in contact with them?
I don't so much keep in contact, I hate to say it, with my family in Nigeria, because a lot of my immediate family is not in Nigeria anymore. It's in England and in America, actually. So.
Personally, in my own experience, is that people back home, if there is that constant, so when you go back, it's quite helpful.
Yeah.
You have a cultural shock. You have everything when you go back. But that contact, which will be done maybe minimal, but build up to the.
Yeah. No, totally agree.
Ade, how challenging would it be to get the Urantia Book in university libraries? And what would the networking be to make that happen?
I think it would be worth talking to the reader on the ground in Nigeria. I don't think it would be difficult to get it into university libraries. I'd be surprised if a university library said no way. My only concern is how long it would stay in the library. I suspect someone will take it out and you can never see the book. Again, that would be my experience.
It would be in the country.
It will be in the country, but I couldn't guarantee it would be in the library. It may have changed. Perhaps I'm slightly jaded. It may have changed.
You spoke a bit about the need for emerging leaders. How would you describe an emerging leader? What kind of skills would they have, or what are you thinking of when you position that as a very important piece?
I'm thinking that somebody whose values and whose leadership is underpinned by the book. Somebody who's thinking about not his own or her own profile, but what they can do to serve and what they can do to disseminate the book. It's quite a hard sell, because I almost think, I always think this book is not the chess club. So you really do need people who are inspirational and charismatic. It's a lot to ask of a leader. What you don't really want are people who don't really have a really, what I consider a grounded concept of their leadership. It's not about personal profile. It's about service. It's about cosmic values. It's about bigger picture thinking. That's what I mean. My concern is, if you say to people, form a local association, yeah, they will. But you may not necessarily get the leadership of the caliber you want. And it's just been my experience, not so much in Nigeria, it's been more my experience in the UK. We've struggled, to find leadership to drive us forward. And I'm just trying to translate that and say, I'm not, what I'm saying is just study groups. Somebody may emerge from the study group who has a really strong vision, really good leadership skills, nurture that. And my concern is don't necessarily push people and say you've got to have a local association. Yeah, they'll form one, but it may not go far, may not go anywhere.
I love what you just said. It's like I want to capture what you just said and hold on to it, because I think it's so right on the money and it's so important. And what I really heard is you want people who become leaders from being inspired by the book.
Yes.
And it will come out of them. It's not somebody who's been, the senator and wherever. It's someone who is just so inspired and it lives in them so completely.
Yes.
That they become a leader.
Yes.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's worth being patient about that. It may be slightly counterintuitive, but
At the risk of generalizing, we're going to hear about Uganda, but I don't really know Africa that well. I've been to Nigeria several times, but my experience was very minimal. How much of what you told us applies to other countries, other people? How much can we generalize?
I thought about that. I think a lot of it does. I don't think Nigeria is unique. I think there is a kinship across Africa, because many things that Kat said resonated with me. You could well be talking about Nigeria. So I think what might be different is the political situation. There is something peculiarly Nigerian about it. I don't necessarily, you might go to the next country. If you went to the Benin Republic next door, you get many of the superstitions, many of the fears, but you might not get this big problem that you've got with militant Islam. So there are nuances, but I think it's pretty similar across Africa. And to be honest with you, I mean, when I was, researching and thinking and reading the book, everything I said about Nigeria is actually rooted in the book. If you read the stuff on shamanism, if you read the stuff on family life, if you read the stuff on the instability of marriage, the book is a planetary book. It covers Africa. It covers the whole planet, and Africa is found within that. And if you look at your own societies, some of the things, the superstitions and the kind of lack of education are just further back in certain societies' development. Africa is now trying to come out of that. So it's part of, the human condition. It's just, slightly out of kilter, maybe. The world could be almost divided into halves. The Urantia Book talks about half the world believes in magic and the other half believes in science, so.
I just heard a statistic that Nigeria in specific, but Africa in general, is going to have a large portion of the young population of the planet in the next 50 years because of the childbirth rate, which is increasing all around. The Chinese are facing now demographic problems within themselves, American and Europe. So many of the youngsters of the world are going to be African in 2 generations. And we have to think about that. Africa is going to be the center of the growth, and then I envision that just like we've seen the last decade, Africans are going to start to push out, and immigration is going to move these people out to other countries. And
I think what's happening, the birth rate amongst the educated elite is falling, fortunately. So people generally are having about 3 children. But what's happening, children are living, because what was happening before, you were getting quite high infant mortality, and apparently improvements in health means that people are living. So the actual population of Africa is increasing. So, and also there is not that attitude that, there is climate change, so I'm not going to have children. I have not yet come across an African that has said that yet. It's true, childlessness amongst women in Africa was very, very rare when I was growing up. It was never due to choice, and it was always very frowned on. Changing slightly, but not shifting so much that people are really, you're getting this idea that we've decided to be childless. It's rare. I mean, you know, I stand to be corrected, but I'm yet to come across anyone. So family is still very important.
You're right. Most African cultures, you have to have a child. That's like one of the culture, all the cultural norms. You must have a child for you to qualify to be human, whatever it is. Yeah, so you're right. Yeah.
Can you speak a little about the health situation there and the mortality and how what's happening?
Yeah, the health situation in Nigeria is quite hard, really, because there isn't really free healthcare, and there seems to be there's not enough emphasis on preventative medicine. There's more, as you would expect. I'm not saying there's none at all. There've been what would I say? There've been advances in the healthcare, but it's still quite patchy. You know, you would ask somebody. I mean, I'll give you an anecdotal story. I asked somebody. She said her sister died, and I said, "Oh, what did she die of?" Which you would ask. She said, "Well, how do we know?" She just died. You know, you are assuming that we had access to the facilities that you have access to. She just died, and that also influences Nigerians in the way they think, because they don't understand. These diseases seem to spring up from nowhere. People just die. So is it some demon that's caused this? Is it some spirit that's caused this? You know, people will go to church for healing, etc., etc. Simply because you do have big teaching hospitals, but you do not have the penetration of the kind of health services that you take for granted, you know, in more developed societies. So that is quite a big issue in Nigeria, and it's also quite expensive for some people.
Just to add on what I said, for example, Uganda, most of the budget for health is sponsored by UN or World Health Organization. So government does not have a budget for the health system as per se.
Okay.
So they rely on aid most of the time. Much as all the facilities are sponsored by the World Health Organization or NGOs or something.
Right.
So somehow they may not have capacity to provide health services all over the country. Yeah, something like that.
Well, and what about the environmental piece? Is it easy to get clean water? You know, how?
It's tricky. It's not. There are places where they don't have pipe-borne water. I mean, the cities, they do, but in the villages, they don't necessarily. There are health scares with poor water. I'm not saying it's prevalent. You know, you can get bottled water. It's just not reliable. Let's put it that way. It's not as bad as some countries, but it's not as reliable as you would expect.
I am curious. You were a truth seeker. Immersed as a child in the Pentecostal religion. I assume that your family, what size is your family? What your family of origin? How many siblings do you have?
Oh, that's a good question. I had 7. I've got 6 now. No, I've got like 4. I had 4 half siblings, then 2 siblings. I lost my eldest sister, so yeah, I've quite a large family.
And they've moved out of Nigeria largely?
Yes. Two of my sisters live in America. One lives in Maryland, one lives in Atlanta. Siblings in England. Yes, the rest of us live in England, yes.
So if you could give us some sense of how you're a family of origin and maybe, you know, a little further out, cousins, aunts, uncles, how have they evolved in terms of Pentecostalism? I assume they were all pretty much immersed in the same.
No.
No.
No, my father was a Seventh-day Adventist. My mother actually belongs to an African church. My father never forced us into any one religion, so I became a born-again Christian. So I then became, when I went to university in Nigeria, became very heavily involved in Pentecostalism. My eldest sister that died, she was a Seventh-day Adventist. My other sister, she belongs to a evangelical church in America. The rest of my family, I don't think of that, don't really engage too much with religion. I did actually introduce the Urantia Book to my stepmother, who initially was very enthused by it, but I'm not entirely certain now whether she still reads it. I did try it on my siblings, but I don't know if they ever got around to reading it. I did hand out books. Since that, I kind of realized it doesn't always work. You sometimes hope that even if they don't read it, somebody else will. But often some people find it quite indigestible. What was quite interesting, actually, my stepmother became very interested in it during this particular economic dislocation in Nigeria, when people were really searching for answers. And I had some quite interesting discussions with her about the Urantia Book. And you know, I started it actually, strangely, I started it with my half-sister. I said, because I was very excited by the Urantia Book. I'm always excited by anything that expands my horizon. I said to my sister, do you know the golden rule? Well, you know, there are about 5 facets to it. It's not just about doing to others as you'll be done by. It's also behaving towards somebody as somebody with a noble mind, behaving somebody as, you know, God would want you to behave to, you know, towards them, etc., etc. And she was really hooked on it. She said, oh, my mother would like to see this book. So I learned sometimes whet people's appetite for the book. Sometimes people find the book too indigestible, too big.
So did you say that your parents, your father and your mother, are still in Africa?
My father passed away. Okay. My mother lives in England, actually.
Okay. So she attends an African church.
Yeah.
In England.
Yes.
And so what is that church like? What are the tenets?
I'll have to say this to you. As a good old charismatic Pentecostal, I refuse to enter her church. Because we old style religionists were always worried about, we had a very narrow view about religion, and we were very worried about the enemy, because you know, some religions was seen completely off the Richter scale. You just did not enter their churches at all. So I wouldn't go into the church with her. I was criticized even to go to the church with her, because but one thing I do know, they do spend a lot of time, I don't know whether they seem to spend a lot of time talking to spirits and angels, and seem to have a first name terms with angels and things like that, and they do some very strange rituals. I've found out from talking to my mother, I know my uncle was very heavily involved in. It's called the Celestial Church of Christ. It blends a lot of African beliefs about demons and spirits and things. But I've never really engaged because of the standoff between, you know, Pentecostals and those churches.
I find it interesting that you talked about the Seventh-day Adventists, and I had done some research on it, and they've basically been able to spread throughout the world with a religious message that isn't, not with a strong religious message, more with a service message. And their healthcare system, that's been another way they've expanded.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, is that idea of expansion with messages that are maybe a bit different from what you normally find, is that something that might be a way to spread the book in Africa?
I think what you said was interesting about if we could find a service would be great, because that's a good way of, I can't say we could necessarily set up a Urantia hospital, because I know the Adventists set up universities, schools, etc. in Africa. But it combined with some sort of service would be great. Yeah, yeah, you're right. The Adventists, because they're not at all conventional, so it just shows that you can have an unconventional, doesn't fit within the norm kind of. I can see it spreading. Also, without wanting to not be practical, but bear in mind, we do have, I think we have the universe supervisors on our side on this. We're not spreading a new religion. We're not spreading another version of Seventh-day Adventism. We are spreading the fifth epochal revelation to this planet. And I'm pretty sure the universe supervisors had always intended the whole of the planet, so we have them on our side. And if the Christian missionaries were able to do it, I cannot see why we cannot do this. We just, to me, have to be patient. It's just going to be slow, and it's going to be difficult, and it's not necessarily going to be linear.
Great place to end and take a break. So thank you again, Ade. Thank you all for your questions. Well done. So we're due back at 11.